Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Good evening, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us for what promises to be a very interesting session. The Phoenix against the Black Swan, how new technologies can help build crisis-proof business models. This talk is part of the Tech Talk X series. Digital technologies, as you know, are taking a central role in the COVID-19 crisis. Technology companies, together with governments, are multiplying efforts to respond to the pandemic and its collaterals globally. In the race to end the calamity, many questions are emerging on the future of the digital economy, business, management, and society post-pandemic. This new series of Tech Talks explores how the COVID-19 crisis is reshaping the global digital transformation and features INSEAD faculty in conversation with leading industry practitioners and thought leaders from our global community. Just a quick word about who I am. I'm Benjamin Kessler, Managing Editor of INSEAD Knowledge. INSEAD Knowledge is INSEAD's Faculty Insights portal, so we invite you to check us out at our website. One particular point of interest may be our COVID-19 vertical. We have dozens of articles covering virtually every major aspect of the COVID-19 crisis. We also have a free mobile app you can download on Google Play or the iOS App Store. And that brings me to introducing our speaker for today, Samir Hasija, Professor of Technology and Operations Management, Shell Fellow in Business and the Environment, and the Chair of the Technology and Operations Management area at INSEAD. His research is all about technology management, and that's the expertise he's sharing with us today. So without any further ado, let me introduce Samir Hasija.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Sorry, it took me a little while to get started with the slide share, and thanks for being a part of this. Thanks for being a part of this event that we've put together for you. Very excited to be here. And what I really wanted to kind of talk about today is essentially something coming out of a book project that we sort of did. Believe it or not, we started about 3 or 4 years ago, and we were talking about a crisis and what firms can do in terms of making sure that they can overcome a firestorm disruption, which can pretty much challenge their existence. And we had no idea when we started writing this that obviously we're going to get into a situation like COVID, and hence the sense of urgency that we were talking about has become even more. What I would say is important and pressing. So I'm very happy to share some insights with you that has come out of a lot of the work that we've been doing in writing this book, and walking you through some of the ideas that we'll be presenting. Now, to give you a kind of a big picture idea of why we started getting into this thinking, or why was this idea of a firestorm disruption, something that challenges the very existence of an organization came about, it all started actually at INSEAD when we were getting into our senior executive programs. We realized that many of the executives feel that they are not prepared for disruption that can come and strike them at any point in time. And many of them would come in and ask us, how do we get ready for something that we don't even know? And so we started kind of digging deeper into this topic and saying, well, what are some of the things that stop organizations from being proactive about handling any kind of oncoming disruption, so to speak? And what we found was that every time we started to dig a bit deeper, we found that the big blockers that stop senior leaders from making sure that their organizations are disruption proof is to some extent a blinkered mindset, a mindset which has been, and not for any fault of anybody, it's very natural, a mindset that has been created that comes from training, which relies on successes from the past. And in some sense, the very things that made people successful in the past may very well become blockers of trying to reinvent yourself in the future. So that was kind of the basic idea that we started thinking about. And so the natural question that came to us was, how do we overcome this mindset? How do we overcome these blockers? And so we said, if we have to overcome these blockers, And we have to be able to speak to executives no matter what industry they come from, no matter what firm they are. We need to start thinking about a process, a method, more than a framework, because these frameworks, no matter how hard you try, they will either be too trivial or they would be too specific to a particular context. You would never be able to get a non-trivial framework that can be applied broadly. But what, of course, you can do is you can start thinking about a process. And we call our process the Phoenix Encounter Method, which essentially relies on a central idea that you have to envision your own destruction before you can try and figure out what is it that you need to do to reinvent the future of your organization. In other words, you have to imagine an extreme attack, an attack that challenges your very existence in an unconstrained environment. And we give you a lot of resources to try and do that. And once you imagine an extreme attack, then you start asking yourself some questions. What is it that I need to do in terms of my business model? What is it that I need to do in terms of technology? What is it that I need to do in terms of my leadership in order to be able to defend myself against that attack? And once you start asking yourself these questions, and you've gone through this exercise of an unconstrained attack, and then challenge yourself of what you can start doing in terms of defending yourself, some answers start emerging. And these answers, what we have discovered, and we've done this with more than 1,500 executives in the last, almost 4 years now, what we find is that these answers then lead to some very interesting strategic directions, strategic options, which previously were unimaginable for many of these executives that we've done it for. So this is the premise. This is the idea of what we are pushing forward. And we find it quite valuable, and I'm really excited to share some insights about this. Now, of course, if we are going to talk about the future, and like I said, it's your past that can be the one that traps you, that cages you. You have to start thinking about, how do I break this trap, this blinkered thinking? And the first step, before you even get into the encounter, the Phoenix Encounter Method, is you need to start thinking of what's happening in this world. And I need to do, and you need to do a very broad scan. What is happening in the industry? What is happening in things outside my industry? What is happening in all the geographies of the world, even if I don't have business in those geographies of the world? And quite often we find that this scan is the first step towards breaking blinkered thinking. So what I'm going to do today, since we don't have a lot of time, right? In the limited time that we have, what I'll do is, in the context of COVID, which of course we know is an incredibly difficult time for all of us in more ways than one. I'll do a quick scan with you, give you a little bit of a panoramic view of what are companies, what are organizations in different parts of the world, in different industries doing in order to give themselves a chance of survival, and also to set themselves up for a surge post-crisis, right? What are they doing? And once we start doing this scan, we will then start putting into some sense making of this scan to say, well, what does this mean to me? What does this mean to you and to your organizations, right? So this is kind of the things that we want to do within the setup of our conversation today, all right? So moving on to COVID, and we've seen crisis before, but a lot of experts say that this is perhaps a crisis which we've never seen, or at least the nature of this crisis is that we've never seen before. More so because of its global impact, right? I mean, there's almost nobody who's insulated from what's going on. And of course, this started off as a health crisis. And what we'll do is we have a small poll for you. And what I'll do is we'll launch this poll for you, because while I talk to this crisis, it'll be really interesting for us to also see some of your thoughts that come about from the poll, right? So now, if you think about this crisis, right, and if you think about all the things that it's doing, it started off as a healthcare crisis, but it very quickly morphed into a business crisis. Why? Because in absence of a vaccine, the only viable solution that we had in order to fight this crisis, or at least slow it down, was to go into a complete state of lockdown. And the minute you go into a complete state of lockdown, you start disrupting businesses. You have demand issues. You have supply issues. You're going to have access issues where people, even if they want your product, simply cannot go and access whatever it is that you're selling, the product or a service. And that suddenly starts creating all sorts of business issues, so to speak, right? And so what we saw in this crisis, of course, is what started off as a health issue quickly spiraled into a big business issue. And of course, the way you want to think about this is, you know, while this has created new ways of living, new ways of working, and perhaps even new ways of learning now that we're in a business school, you cannot help but ask yourself, you know, are these changes permanent or are these changes temporary? Perhaps not all of them are permanent, and I hope many of them are not permanent. But which one of these are permanent and which one of these are temporary? How does it make a difference to me? You know, should you as a business rethink your business model based on what you've experienced in the crisis? Or is this a temporal trend? You know, perhaps there's an opportunity sitting for you in terms of the way you run your business. You know, what are the long-term implications of this crisis? These are all questions that you have to start thinking about. And these are all things that are important for you as you design your post-crisis future, so to speak. Maybe we can share the results. So I'm actually very curious to see how the results of the poll turned out. So, you know, all of you can see it, and if there were a lot of questions, so you can scroll through this. So did your organizations experience demand and supply shock? Well, it turns out 86% of you say yes. And of course, that's not a surprise, right? There are very few businesses which are insulated from this. How much has your company changed its processes due to the crisis? And again, it seems we are quite evenly split between a fair amount versus not very much. And that's also interesting. But what's also very interesting is there's a non-trivial fraction of people who have said that there has been a lot of change in their business processes. How effective was the change so far? Again, positively surprised that strongly positive is non-trivial, 10%, but about 44% of you say positive. So, you know, more than 50% of the audience have had positive or strongly positive results so far. How much role did technology play? Again, overwhelming numbers, about 68% say technology played a fairly significant role in facilitating this change. And this is really, really interesting. Do you think this change is permanent? And about 58% of you think it's permanent. And only 17% think it's not permanent, and the rest are undecided. This is really fascinating stuff, and I'm glad to see these results. We'll come back to this poll because I want to share some of these ideas with you, and we'll come back to talking about how you've thought about this. But this is not a surprise, but still very, very interesting to see the results of this. Thanks a lot for answering this. Now, if I move from this crisis forward, you know, the simple question that people will ask is, Samir, and I've been getting these questions from a lot of people, is like, hey, okay, we get it. This is a crisis. How do we solve, or how do we make sure that this crisis doesn't impact us? And the standard answer that anybody will give you is, okay, clearly you need to build agility. And this is something, and people have said resilience, robustness, but really in my mind, what you really are thinking about is building agility. So what is agility? And let's kind of define agility a little bit more carefully. Agility, in my mind, is flexibility to be able to adapt to these shocks, to be able to become faster in terms of your response, and perhaps to be even able to anticipate things slightly better than other people. Now, what a lot of people misunderstand about agility is that agility is about having a buffer. It's about having some sort of slack in my system so that once I see a shock, I'm able to use that slack that I built into the system in order to address that shock. Now, let me tell you why that's a misunderstanding of agility is because you cannot buffer for a black swan event. You simply cannot. I mean, you can try, but I cannot imagine any sort of ROI calculation where such black swan or buffering for such black swan events would be justified. You have no idea when the next crisis of such magnitude is going to take place. So how do you create buffer or slack or excess capacity for events like this? You cannot, and perhaps economically it doesn't make sense. What you do create, of course, or what you need to think about is, can I not necessarily create this slack, but can I create the ability to suddenly be operating as if I had the slack? Which means, can I switch my business model from A, which is, let's say, a steady state efficient business model where I'm running it based on efficiency, to a business model B, which I'm running for responsiveness, which I'm running for not necessarily efficiency, but more flexibility. And remember, if I'm running for flexibility, it's expensive. But can I create the ability to shift between A and B when I need to shift between A and B? And that is the real idea of agility. And the question is that even possible, right? And what I'll do next is I'll give you some examples of what I see that, yes, of course it's possible, but it's not possible by just thinking about it. There's a lot of background work that needs to go in it. And some of it may seem tactical, but it actually turns out that these somewhat tactical things that you do end up giving you a lot of strategic advantage when it comes to agility. So that's going to be my setup, right? And again, it's difficult. It's difficult to speak to an audience like an INSEAD audience, simply because I know this audience, right? You're a very diverse audience with all sorts of industries, geographies, et cetera, et cetera. So how do I give you something which is valuable for everybody? Luckily, it turns out that what we are talking about can be mapped out to the entire value chain. So whether you're talking about consumer-facing businesses, whether you're talking about back office operations like manufacturing, whether you're talking about further upstream stuff like sourcing and supply chain stuff, or all the way to product development and engineering and design. No matter how you look at the value chain, what we are observing, of course, is there is a lot of development in terms of how technologies are facilitating the development of this agility, okay? And the way I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about technologies, which is what I call as resources. And then I'm going to talk about business processes, because technologies in itself is not going to be the source of agility. It's how technologies get combined with business processes is where the real aha of agility is. Okay. Now, I'm not going to spend so much time on all the technologies, but let me get to the first and the most kind of obvious one, the one that glares at us, is AI, or intelligent automation. Now, obviously, AI has something been talked about for the last couple of years a lot, right? And many companies have been trying to get AI ready. But what we saw during this crisis is that those who had this AI readiness advantage were able to quickly leverage this technology to scale up their capacity and operate efficiently during crisis. So certain examples, right? Suddenly certain businesses started seeing surge volumes coming in from customers in terms of queries. I need to cancel my tickets. I need to change my plans. Will I be able to get my product in time? Will I be able to get my service? All sorts of customer questions. This created surge capacity, which the usual contact center simply is not geared up to handle. What we saw in early applications was that AI was brought in to be able to provide some insights, to provide some help to organizations in dealing with this kind of surge in consumer volumes. We were able to see the application of AI getting beefed up in automated hiring practices. So firms that still needed to hire, but because of social distancing and lockdowns, they simply couldn't go through the regular hiring protocols. Well, they were able to leverage automated technologies to facilitate, to augment, or even to make their hiring processes smoother. Of course, we also saw some challenges. We saw that algorithms and data from the past are not experienced to handle these sudden demand and supply shocks, and these black swan events still needed human oversight on these algorithms, simply because the data didn't exist on how to handle this. For example, the kind of questions that people were asking, these are not the kind of data that was available for the AI systems to be able to answer in a seamless manner, right? So these are things that were emerged as challenges. Nonetheless, the technology became very useful, and the use became even more apparent in healthcare, where people needed to start thinking about forecasting hotspots for where the pandemic may be spreading or where the contagion is really high. A very interesting example is where Kinsa, which is this very interesting company, they make these thermometers which are IoT enabled, but they also collect data in the back and they do analysis, is they were able to collect data of spikes in temperature, especially in communities where healthcare is not prevalent, or at least not at the level at which it needed to be. And they were able to get, and I agree that temperature is not a good predictor of COVID, but at least they were able to see whether there were some unusual spikes in temperatures in certain neighborhoods in order to see whether they need to do some proactive measures of testing or not, right? And this turned out to be quite useful in certain underprivileged communities, especially in the US. Of course, it has many questions that also got exacerbated. All this data and AI technology has been dealing with issues around privacy, and we haven't solved those issues yet. And suddenly we now get into a state where these kind of issues now get exacerbated. So it also highlighted the need to quickly have good solutions around issues of data integration, data security, privacy, et cetera, right? So AI became a very interesting solution. The next technology I want to talk about is robotics. And actually, there were some journalists who even hailed robots as heroes in the crisis. And I mean, you can see there's a little bit of a hyperbole, but robots certainly started playing a very important role, especially in healthcare, if you think about it, right? So they're contagion-proof workers in some sense, right? They were used in disinfecting services. They were used to deliver food and medicine for patients because, you don't want to expose your hospital staff too much to infection. Of course, they'll do certain things that need to be done. But can I deliver food using a robot? In Singapore is a very interesting example. The Singapore government experimented with this robot that I have in my slide, the Spot, which is the robotic dog, which became helping create social distancing, became a social distancing advocate in public parks, trying to remind people to maintain certain amount of distance. So this became a pretty interesting experiment that people were running and certainly were very useful in the short run. Now, what was really interesting, and things that you don't see in the news because they're perhaps not as, as cute as the robot dog, so to speak, but, e-commerce firms, which are facing a lot of pressure and demand, needed to make sure that they are overcoming their bottlenecks, which is, to a large extent, their bottlenecks are, processes in the warehouse, and they needed to overcome them. Well, they doubled down on their investments in robotics to try and automate very, very constrained processes like order picking in warehousing. And so, Firms like Kroger and Ocado is a robotic solution provider, went into an understanding where Ocado would power, Kroger's back office or Kroger's warehouse services. And this is turning out to be quite interesting, a development. And I mean, this is already in the mix. This just got accelerated, so to speak, right? Robotic delivery became very, very important. Think about countries like Rwanda, where, the road infrastructure is not so easy. It can take an entire day for delivery by road. Automated drones were able to provide delivery in about half an hour, which is it's a huge difference in some sense in terms of speed and capability in responding to a crisis. By the way, Zipline is not just operating now in developing countries. People have started thinking about how drone delivery systems can be used as we start thinking about creating a supply chain to deliver vaccines, even in developed countries like the US, right? So this is going to become an important play as we start thinking of recovery from the crisis. Now, of course, I talk about these technologies, but I have to warn you, and I'm very conscious of this, that I don't want to sound like an evangelist constantly pushing these technologies, right? These technologies are great, but you have to constantly ask yourselves, is this technology going to generate value in the future? One of the recommended readings that we'll have for you is an article that I wrote on HBR on robotics, asking this very question that, think about it, on an empty road during lockdowns, I can have an automated robot do deliveries. But the minute I'm out of lockdown and the road is now full of traffic and pedestrians, will that technology be effective? Or suddenly that technology turns out to be not so good, right? In an empty road, it's a very easy thing for a robot to do the deliveries. So you have to ask yourself these questions that, are we seeing temporal trends, or are we jumping too soon to some conclusions that, wow, this is going to change the way businesses run in the future? And so I would like you to think about what is permanent, what is temporal, and what would it take to make it permanent, right? So some thoughts on there would be very useful. I'll just take a couple of more minutes to talk about a couple of more technologies, and then we can take a breather and see if you have some questions, and then I'll move to the process part. Now, AR and VR technology became augmented reality, virtual reality. These technologies became very useful. As you can imagine, again, it's a lockdown friendly technology, right? So imagine, real estate agents trying to sell houses. Well, you're not going to have people visiting people's homes. You can't do an open house where, prospective buyers are going to come in. So how did the real estate agents adapt to this? Well, the ones which are technology forward, what they did was they took VR-enabled videos of the property that they were trying to sell, and they allowed prospective buyers to be able to get a feel of the properties based on VR technology. Now, this is not, some people can argue, well, this is not the same as looking at the property, and I agree, but this is still better than looking at a photograph, right? So it kind of gets you a feel of what is it that you may buy, and even though this may not lead to the same number of sales that you would have seen if the people were to see the property in person, this would at least shorten the post-recovery cycle of sales, because some people may have used this to narrow down the properties that they're interested in. So just a small example, but this technology was used for new employee training, getting people ready, which you cannot do because they simply cannot come on site. This technology became useful in remote maintenance and operations, where the maintenance folks could put on the VR glasses and actually do the maintenance and running of operations of equipment that they couldn't access because they were remote, right? And finally, the technology that I want to talk about, which is also, if you think about it, provides you with a lot of flexibility, is 3D printing. Now, 3D printing became a big deal in COVID as well, and starting all the way from nasal swabs, so testing equipment, to PPE like hygiene masks or face shields, even to something more complicated like respirators and eventually even simple ventilators, not the full-blown ventilators. This became a very, very important technology to try and provide quick, adaptive, reactive capacity where you don't have enough capacity to cater to this sudden surge in demand, right? And this is a very useful technology. Of course, there are caveats to this too, because if not done properly, you can end up making equipment which can hurt rather than help, right? So using a face shield which is not up to the standards of what medical equipment needs to be can be a problem. But of course, assuming that the standards can be met, or at least the ones that are making this stuff are being conscious of the standards, this can be remarkably useful in creating surge capacity, which otherwise would be prohibitively expensive, right? And the beauty of the way the world reacted to this was that, well, you don't need to have a 3D printer. You don't need to buy a 3D printer. There are marketplaces that got formed which could give you access to a 3D printer, which means you don't have to invest the capital. You can get it on demand. And these marketplaces were not just 3D printers, by the way. They give you access to all sorts of manufacturers out there who were willing to repurpose their manufacturing plants. Breweries who no longer wanted to brew alcohol, but decided that they have the ability to make sanitizers or sanitizing equipment, right? So, and these marketplaces give you access to these new suppliers that are not a part of your traditional supply chain or value chain, that would be very expensive for you to put as a regular part of your supply chain. And this is what created a lot of flexibility. Now, I think I've gone on for a fair amount of time. Why don't I take a quick break here, Ben, and see if people have some questions, and then we can continue from then on.
Great. Thank you, Samir. Thank you. We had a lot of great questions. And one question that's come in through the Q&A, which is really interesting, is someone wants to know what the applicability is to banking, specifically as a sector. And I'd like to expand that question a little bit, because you talk about the panoramic scan, the importance of scanning widely. Why is that necessary? I mean, shouldn't you just look at your sector, what's happening in your sector, and be really familiar with that and try to outdo all the competitors and possible competitors in that sector? Why not limit yourself and make it easier?
I mean, this is a great question, Ben. And we're often asked this question, and I often say that the interesting part about disruption and innovation is that you have no idea where and when it's going to come and hit you. And in fact, some of the biggest disruptions come and hit you from places you expected the least. Okay. And I'll come back to banking in a minute, but I'll give you some small examples, right? Favorite examples think about GPS devices that we used to have in our cars. Now, certain members of the audience may be too young to know that, but not so long ago, we used to have these devices in our cars, right? Well, they got taken out by Apple and the phone industry. So what does Apple have to do with GPS devices, right? Like, so you get hit by, you can get hit by disruption that can come from any place, right? Look at the bank, right? Technically, what's the world's biggest bank? If you really think about it, Ant Financial would be the world's biggest bank. And so you should ask yourself, right, what does a B2B, Alibaba, a B2B marketplace set up selling commoditized industrial products back in the day, 15 years ago, if somebody said, well, this company is going to come and start disrupting banks, perhaps people would have said, nah, well, we provide so much trust. There is so much things that we bring in that it's impossible for somebody like a B2B e-commerce platform to start threatening our business. Well, I must tell you, if you're a bank right now, especially in the consumer banking industry, you should be most scared of players like Alibaba, players like Amazon, players like Google, which have nothing to do traditionally with the banking industry, right? And by the way, you do know that Alibaba or Ant Financial is actively seeking banking licenses all over the world, right? So including Singapore, Bank of Ireland, so on and so forth. They've applied for licenses everywhere. And it only takes one regulator to approve the license because, once one regulator does it, everybody else is very happy to copycat, right? So by the way, another example, this happened before the crisis. Grab Taxi, which is the Uber equivalent in Singapore, so to speak. Grab Taxi recently applied for a banking license when Monetary Authority of Singapore, when the Monetary Authority of Singapore said, hey, we are happy to have fintechs apply for banking licenses. And this must be in the works, and I'm pretty sure it'll go through. But again, what does a ride hailing, a taxi sharing, a Uber equivalent of Southeast Asia have to do with a banking license? Well, that's the way the world is going, right? So you have to have a very wide scan to be able to figure out what will come and disrupt you. That's number one. And so, yeah, I guess that's the main point to your question.
Another interesting point that came in, I mean, you're a technology management professor. We said that from the very beginning. So that should probably shadow this comment, but someone in the Q&A said, because you're focusing so much on technology, are you implying that the ideal form of organization is people light, technology heavy?
See, this is a great segue for the next segment that I'm going to go to. People light, technology heavy is definitely a direction in which many organizations will go, if not all. Okay. The question is, how long will it take to go there? And for some, the journey would be faster. For some, it will be slower. But one has to stop themselves and ask, what technology is really giving me today? And I don't think it's about of going down on headcount as the main advantage. The biggest advantage that I see is the speed, the responsiveness, the ability, the agility to move your focus from one to the other in a seamless and relatively low cost way is what technology is giving you. And this will become a little bit obvious as I move forward. Now, as you start getting these scope advantages from technology, you realize that you also get scale advantages. And naturally, as you start getting scale advantages, you have to start thinking, do you start becoming people light or not? And people light does not mean that I let go of people. People light just means that I can do a lot more things with the same number of people I have today than I was able to do yesterday, right? So that's the way I would like to think about this. So, but yes, definitely the amount of work, I mean, again, back to Ant Financial, the number of employees they have for the amount of money they manage is significantly less than a typical Bank of America or a Citibank or a Chase or JP Morgan Chase or any one of those. I'm talking about orders of magnitude different. So yes, this is an eventual path that people will have to consider.
You mentioned relatively low cost, and that leads me into the next question. I feel like this will be the last one, and then we'll move on to the next section. You mentioned relatively low cost, and I guess that would be a necessity for companies now. They're cash strapped. Cash flow is in a desperate situation for many firms. How can they even consider moving into AI, robotics, virtual reality? How is this even a financial possibility for them?
So Ben, what we are seeing is that those who were already AI ready, and I'll talk about what I mean by AI ready right towards the end of this webinar. But those who were technology enabled and had those systems built in, they were able to move there almost overnight. Okay. Your question is pertaining to those who are not ready, right? And how are they going to do it when it's costly? See, the beauty of the world today is that you don't have to do it by yourself. You may choose to do it by yourself. And there are a lot of examples of companies who've done it by themselves. You know, Fidelity, for example, it's a great story of a company that went in, a legacy organization went in, but obviously they invested a lot of effort and time to get themselves into that position where they did it. But there are equal number of examples. Mom and pop stores who did not have the resources, do not have the resources, were able to do it. You know why? Because the big tech giants of the world provide this as a service. So what is AWS? What is Alibaba Cloud? What is the biggest business of Microsoft, which is cloud now today? I mean, I shouldn't say biggest, but one of the biggest surges in their business is their cloud. Well, that's their business. That's what is bringing them the most amount of money. What are they doing? They're saying, you are a small, medium enterprise. You do not have the resources, but you need to be technologically forward. You know what? We will provide you with this infrastructure, and you can use this infrastructure as a service without making these investments. And we can then create a backbone for you to suddenly become technologically ready. And by the way, not only can you use this infrastructure, you can also use our algorithms, and you can use all the software that we've made if you don't want to use your own algorithms and software. So you can use software as a service, the infrastructure as a service, and all of this is now available on demand based on access rather than ownership. And this changes the investment game. You don't have to invest. Now, as you start using them and you start scaling up and you start becoming big, then you have to ask yourself this question that, should I now be accessing this, or now am I big enough to invest and create my own? And that's a question that every corporate strategy team at some point in their life has to answer. But the starting inertia, the roadblock, is not there anymore, because you have this technology that you can tap into. You just have to have the mindset to start doing it, right? And I'll give you some examples of companies who've done it quite well.
That's great. Well, then let's move on, and we'll have more questions in a bit.
Okay, great. Let me go back to my presentations and share this again. Ben, you can see this, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, so we've spent a lot of time talking about technologies, but I'm going to quickly spend some more time talking a little bit about processes and how these technologies have sort of come together. And I put it all in the envelope or the bucket of what I call as platform technology or platformatization. Sorry, I'm ruining the English language, but that is the word that I really want to use. Now, what is a platform? Essentially, everybody knows a platform, right? And again, this word is overused, but the Uberization of the world. But hospitals, of course, were first in need. There was a massive amount of shortages. And at the same time, there were places where surplus equipment was available for PPE, personal protection equipment. And so these platforms started kind of acting, and some even were ad hoc or short-term platforms that were put in place. Some were, of course, pre-existing, that came in that allowed, on one hand, hospitals to interact with PPE manufacturers, with other manufacturers that just had surplus capacity that could repurpose that capacity to make PPE. And obviously individuals or organizations that had excess supply to then create a fruitful exchange of equipment. And as you know, if you create an exchange like this, you increase the overall efficiency because you solve the problem of too much on one side and too little on the other side, right? So this kind of platform takes care of that. This started happening, and by the way, I'm going to go quick and have a plethora of examples from different areas just to show you that this is not a one-off example. On-demand freight in the B2B world and warehousing, platforms started coming in, whether it was ocean or air freight marketplaces to quickly allow people to ship equipment because their regular supply chains were constrained. On-demand trucking came in to augment and add capacity. Even on-demand warehousing came in. And again, the value proposition was on-demand access, real-time capacity visibility, and variable cost structure. So you don't have to invest in suddenly building all this excess capacity that you don't know whether you will need after the crisis, right? So that was the huge advantage that you got from this. And Alibaba is a very interesting example to me in their B2B business, especially in the international B2B business, right? They realized that even though they're tech forward, that they were not quite there. They needed to do new things. A lot of the international business was on face-to-face meetings in trade shows. Well, they needed to create a live streaming version of those trade shows, right? they realized that their logistics system was not good enough for international movement of goods. So Alibaba is a platform, but then Alibaba tapped into other platforms which provide these freight solutions, which enable them to fulfill, to whatever extent possible, their international trade kind of obligations. And interestingly, that was at the international side. At the domestic side, Alibaba's platform became useful for local retailers, the mom and pop stores, for restaurants, and not just the typical, consumer goods seller on Alibaba, but also, farmers were able to get on these platforms to sell their stuff. Real estate agents were able to get on these platforms. And by the way, it's not just Alibaba, right? A whole bunch of platforms there, JD and so on and so forth, which were able to enable quickly, overnight, set up systems such that people can tap into their platform and overcome the constraints that the demand and supply shocks or these lockdowns have imposed on the system. And this turned out to be hugely valuable to both businesses as well as the society, right? And by the way, it's not just China. Right? I'll give you a bundle of examples. I mean, let's go to Kenya, right? In Kenya, we had this B2B fresh platform called Twiga, right? Now, B2B, so farmers are selling to businesses. Well, businesses, restaurants, et cetera, are going to disappear. So we need to somehow repurpose the farmers' capacity to go directly to consumers. But, these platforms are not ready because this is a B2B platform to immediately go to consumers. It's a very complicated business. You can't just set it up overnight. So what did Twiga do? Well, Twiga ended up partnering with Jumia, which is a B2C platform. And this partnership suddenly allowed them again, it's not costless, but in a lower cost manner to allow farmers to directly get stuff to end users, which previously was unimaginable, right? So they enabled that in a fairly swift and low cost manner. And this is not just developing, because a lot of people can say, hold on, developing countries can do this because they sort of leapfrog many constraints. I'll give you an example which is as legacy as it gets. The Paris, the Rungis International Market. This market dates back to the 12th century. This is one of the oldest and the biggest wholesale fresh food market in the world, right? Again, B2B business primarily, and B2B business disappeared. So what did they do? Well, they started creating partnership with Caliph Fraz to essentially try and create this B2C business and try and cater to end consumers directly, right? So skipping the B2B route altogether. Let me take a pause. Whether this is permanent or temporary is a question that you have to ask yourself. But what is very, very important is to keep an eye on what are people doing, but more importantly, how are they able to do it so swiftly and so seamlessly? What is enabling that? And these are the questions that you have to ask yourself to decide, hey, what is it that you need to do for your business, right? And that's an important one. Some other examples which I find quite fascinating. Food delivery platforms, of course, became really popular, right? Everybody started relying on them. I certainly became a very valued customer of the food delivery platforms in Singapore, and this became a family tradition for us, especially on the weekend, to go and see, hey, what else can we order that we perhaps try a restaurant that we haven't tried before. Turns out these delivery platforms, because they were the ones delivering, going individually to home. Well, they realized, why do they have to limit themselves to meal delivery? Well, you can go into groceries, we can go into pharmacy, we can even do apparel delivery. Believe it or not, they also started delivering for Huawei and Apple, where people wanted to do instant shopping. I buy a phone, I don't want to wait for my phone. Can this be delivered to me? So again, you wouldn't have imagined that a food delivery platform will also deliver your newly bought iPhone to you, but turns out they can. And of course they will, because this is one way that they can diversify their revenue streams, right? And so it's a win-win situation from every perspective. The consumer is better off, Apple is better off, these platforms are better off. Is this permanent or not is another story, right? A little example from Philippines, where a very interesting example where local mom and pop stores, which still had some access to consumers, were immediately able to provide banking services. And of course, they were able to use digitized, connectivity to provide banking services to citizens. And again, we're talking about a big chunk of the country which lives outside of tier 1 cities, which means that access to bank is a big deal for them. They have to travel a fair amount of distance. And during lockdowns, that's near impossible, right? So these organizations partnered with these local mom and pop stores, your corner stores, essentially, and they provided banking services to citizens in an efficient and seamless manner. And this became a very interesting innovation that came about forced due to the lockdowns, right? And of course, we started seeing things like telemedicine, which right now, of course, we are seeing, telemedicine is something that has been talked about for a long time. But again, what has happened now is that these platforms started seeing a sharp uptake because of the lockdowns, especially for procedures which are non-emergency, right? Where you've done some blood tests and you want the doctor to read your blood reports. Well, you perhaps don't have to see the doctor, right? This can be done from home, or you're doing a follow-up visit from a specialist who's on a long-term treatment plan with you, migraines, pain management, allergy management, so on and so forth. Many of these treatments don't require the doctor to immediately be physically able to examine a patient. And hence this can be done through telemedicine. And this certainly saw an uptake in telemedicine. And by the way, the limitations of physical examination are also now being overcome, or at least there's an attempt to overcome them, to overcome those limitations using hardware technology. So I'll give you an example. Very interesting startup from Israel, TytoCare. And what they're doing is they're producing hardware that you can get along with your subscription to this service, where you at home can use this hardware. So let's say as a parent, you can use this hardware as directed by a doctor who's connected with you on the platform. And that hardware will then do some sort of imagery, collect, and has sensors that will collect information of vitals, et cetera, and in real time transmit it to the doctor, who can then use that to at least do some basic examination. This may not be a complete replacement of a physical exam by a doctor, but this can certainly limit the number of people that need to visit a doctor, right? Even in the long run, even as we come out of the crisis, because many regular visits could be done like this. And then the doctor could say, you know what, I need you to see me in person because I need to see this a little bit more carefully, as opposed to a regular visit. Yep, you're fine, we're good, let's talk to each other in 6 months, right? So these kind of things are very, very interesting in the way they're developing. Employee sharing became a very interesting idea, right? Where there were a lot of kind of work which is not needed, which became redundant. Think about airlines, right? Their staff, the air hostesses, the air stewards, the pilots. Many of them are not needed because we are not flying at all, and so many of these employees could be shared with other organizations. Delivery drivers in supermarkets, warehouse workers, call center agents. I know Singapore Airlines also use some of their staff for healthcare services to help with patients who are undergoing treatment in different hospitals, because they certainly had a shortage of, or every country had a shortage of healthcare service providers, right? So these kind of arrangements became useful. Now, of course, when we are back to full airline travel, you're not going to see airline staff working in these places. But what is very interesting is that, even though people may go back to their regular jobs, which I hope happens sooner than later, but has this crisis given us a mindset shift in the sense that it has told us that our employees are actually okay to work for somebody else temporarily when there is a low demand period? And is that a good way to retain my talent, that, I don't have to furlough anybody. They can get a salary. It's just a different kind of work. And I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying that this is a natural experiment that gives the ability to organizations to see, can this be a viable option going forward, right? And this certainly was. And of course, we know that people went into remote work. And, I wrote this piece, and again, this will be a part of one of the readings that we'll put up, where the question that I'm asking is, as people are going into remote work, all of us are in remote work, which means that companies are going to have to re-engineer their processes to facilitate remote work. Well, does that re-engineering of processes suddenly now also allow gig work, where companies can start realizing that, hey, I perhaps don't even need full-time employees for this. For these tasks, I can very easily get gig workers to do this for me. And did that, because gig work, for knowledge at least, has been talked about for many years, but it never really took off. Well, you have to ask yourself, is this crisis a pivotal moment where gig work for knowledge work may actually take off? And if so, what kind of work would be more amenable to gig work? So this article kind of discusses that a little bit for those who are interested in the detail. But again, this is, the sharing of employees became a useful response to crisis. Remote work became a useful response to crisis. But going outside of the crisis, this could then lead to a permanent change in business models, leading to gig-based knowledge work, right? So that's how you connect the dots and say, well, what does that mean to you? Can that make your firm more efficient? Or can that be a disruption for your organization if your organization is in a certain kind of business? These are things that I think are very useful for executives to think about. So by and large, what I really wanted to share with all of you in this short time was to give you an idea of how technology, seemingly tactical, but when used in a clever way, provides a whole bundle of advantages to organizations to cater in a fairly cost-effective manner to demand and supply shocks of a very large magnitude, which you cannot plan for ex ante. You cannot go in building extra capacity that one day such a shock will take place, and I'm going to use this extra capacity to cater to that shock. No, you need something else, and you need to have the agility to suddenly adapt to these movements. And what we saw in these examples, and of course this is not an exhaustive list, but what you saw in these examples were how technology adds a little bit of flexibility that can give you a lot of leverage going forward. And before I take questions, so you would ask me, hold on, Samir, what's the common theme here? And the common theme that I'll tell you is, if you notice, in most, if not all these examples, every organization or example that I talked about that was able to leverage technology overnight to respond to this crisis was built on something that I call as a platform tech stack. It was not necessarily operating like a platform, but it certainly had the technology of what these platforms use. What is that technology? Cloud enabled, where the data is not sitting in silos, driven by software and mobile applications, having APIs that allows you to suddenly plug into systems. If I'm a retailer that wants to sell on Alibaba, it's the API that suddenly allows me to put all my inventory on that store. It's not like I have to talk to some individual who will then create a store for me and then create my catalog there. It's all automated, done through APIs, done through cloud systems. It is this platform tech stack that actually enables this. And Ben, you sort of asked this question earlier too, which is that, how can people without spending too much money get there? Because this kind of stack is available as a service as well. You just have to change your operating dynamics, so to speak. Okay, I went a little bit longer than I intended to on this part, but I think this would be a time to take some more questions, and then I can do a conclusion to end this segment, Ben.
Great. And just stop sharing the slides if you can, Sumio. Thank you. Great. Well, one question really popped out at me from the Q&A, just kind of at the highest possible level, which is, how can we change our mindset to imagine ourselves being disrupted? I mean, that's really what you're talking about. It's what you started with, but it's a tough transition to make in people's minds. So, I mean, what can you say?
Ben, I completely hear that question. In fact, like I said, we've done this exercise with more than 1,500 executives. The one thing that I'll tell you in common is that this mindset is the biggest problem, okay? And our book, which actually talks about the Phoenix Encounter method, is exactly aimed at attacking that mindset. And the way we say this is that before you write down your strategy of what is it that you need to do, you need to go through a serious scan like we just did, and use this scan to create a dramatic war game against your own company. My suggestion would be, after you're done with a scan like this, now envision how can your firm be completely destroyed, cease to exist. What is very interesting is we find of all the 1,500 executives, actually more than that we've dealt with, they do not find it difficult to create a disruptive scenario, a scenario that would take them out. They find it they're insiders. It's very easy for them to know what their weaknesses are, and they very quickly design up a destruction. What is interesting, Ben, is the aha moment that they see then, which is the minute they design that attack scenario, they very quickly realize what should be their strategy, as opposed to what they thought before they did this, what was their strategy. What I'm trying to say here is, by imagining such an extreme disruption during their strategy exercise and thinking about how they could be taken out completely, they then force themselves to build a burning platform, which then eventually in itself lends itself to the change in mindset and change in direction, change in pivot. Our experience has been that everybody that we've done this exercise with finds that the most valuable thing that came out of this exercise for them was the mindset shift, the attitude shift. Let me tell you something more exciting as well. So we do a lot of this with some very senior executives, mostly C-suite executives who come into INSEAD programs, right? CEOs, COOs. What we find, Ben, is quite interesting. After the C-suite executives finish the program, they often give us a call and they're like, hey, Samir, we need to do something. And I said, what do you need to do? He says, I now need to convince my board that we need to do this. Can we redo the Phoenix encounter with the board? Because rather than telling the board, hey, we need to do this, why don't we do the encounter so that the board actually sees the burning platform themselves, and then the mindset shift takes place automatically, which, as you know, even from psychology literature, is much more powerful than somebody trying to tell you that, hey, this is what you need to do. It's much more powerful for you to have that organic realization. And the method that we have in our book facilitates that organic realization.
I can't believe that we've already almost run out of time. I wonder if we just can answer one question really quickly, because so many of the points you made were around partnerships. When you talk about the platform tech stack, you're talking about partnerships. What are some criteria for companies to vet potential partners?
Yeah, I always, in the encounter method, after we do the encounter, we do something called the capability map, right? So one of the things that the encounter method reveals is what is my current capability, but more importantly, what is the capability that I want? At that point in time, when you have to start asking yourself, well, given this capability gap, how am I going to fulfill this capability gap? Am I going to do this through partnerships, or am I going to start building it in-house? And invariably, the answer then, and this is, by the way, something that companies are very good at. In fact, this is something that we've done. I mean, this is the quintessential make, buy, make kind of debate that executives are very, very good at. But the minute you can do your capability, current capability versus the gap, you can then get into this capability, this build versus buy argument, and then figure out who to partner with, who to not. So it's that gap that is the quintessential one. What is it that I need that I don't have?
Great. Well, I believe you have just a concluding message for us.
I do, and I'll take a quick minute to share that, and then we can end. So first of all, thanks for this opportunity. I'm really happy to have the audience that we had here today with us. I hope you were able to get some key messages that I was trying to give. But one of the things that I do want to highlight is that, this deck will be made available to you, and obviously the recording of the webinar will be made available as well. But you need to rethink very carefully of, is this temporary or is this permanent? And I have a very simple framework for you. If you follow this framework, it asks three very simple questions. First question, will this technology adoption or process change continue to be valuable in the future? Will robotic nurses be valuable in the future? Well, if you're in a contagion-free environment, maybe not, right? Maybe some robotic processes in a hospital, but just having robotic nurses may not do the job, right? If the answer is no, then that is a temporary change. However, if the answer is yes, that doesn't mean it's a permanent change. The next question you have to ask yourself is this going to be high cost or not? And if the answer is no, then again, the answer is obvious. If it's high value, low cost, of course, it's a permanent change. When things become interesting is when it's high value, but also high cost. And this is where it becomes tricky. And hopefully one of the messages that you've got from me today is, if it is high value and high cost, getting into a platform tech system, enabling a platform tech in the back that kind of runs your operations is the way that you can get best of both worlds, because it allows you, it gives you the agility to switch this technology on when you need it, switch it off when you don't need it, to switch this process on when you need it, switch it off when you don't need it. This is what gives you the agility, which I think is the useful agility, the low cost, high impact agility. I hope I was able to get you excited about the things that we are talking about in the book. For those of you who are interested, I will shamelessly do a plug for the book. Please go to the website, phoenixencounter.com, register yourself. The book will be available very soon. We are very excited to share some stories from the book. We have some original stories because, like I said repeatedly, we've done the encounter with with thousands of executives, and we have a lot of fresh stories in it, which will flesh out some of the things that I'm talking about in much more detail. Thanks a lot for your time. Ben, this is it from my side.
Thank you so much, Samir. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here, sharing this expertise. For those of you who have been asking, yes, this website is being recorded. Yes, the recording will be available. We'll share it with you along with the slides. So I just wanted to just let you know a little bit more about the upcoming events and through the Tech Talk series. Also, you can join us at the Lifelong Learning LinkedIn page to continue the conversation, explore digital at INSEAD for more information on the global digital transformation happening in the wake of COVID-19. We have upcoming webinars for you to attend, so please do join us. Please do sign up for them. I think that we all had a really enlightening session today, and please do check out the Phoenix Encounter Method book and website. And thanks very much, and have a wonderful day, evening, whatever.